NATO is entering an era of strategic paralysis. Should America continue carrying the alliance? For nearly 8 decades after the end of World War II, NATO has stood as the cornerstone of Western security. Yet the alliance has never been sustained merely by Article 5 or by lofty declarations of political solidarity. Its real foundation has always rested on one indispensable pillar: the overwhelming military power, economic capacity, and global leadership of the United States. That is precisely why President Donald Trump's latest remarks at the NATO summit deserve far more attention than another round of criticism directed at America's European allies. His comments reflect a strategic debate that has quietly gained momentum throughout Washington for years, a debate over whether the United States has been carrying a disproportionate share of the burden for an alliance whose members have not equally shared the responsibilities of collective defense. When asked whether the United States should continue maintaining a large military presence across Europe, President Trump expressed unmistakable frustration with NATO's current structure. In his view, Washington has spent generations investing enormous military, financial, and political resources to safeguard European security. Yet when America has sought meaningful support from its allies during critical security challenges, the response has often fallen far short of expectations. Importantly, Trump's argument was never about abandoning NATO itself. Instead, he questioned whether the alliance still operates under a fair system of burden sharing. This concern has increasingly become a mainstream topic among American defense strategists. Military alliances remain durable only when both benefits and obligations are distributed in a reasonably balanced manner. If one nation consistently shoulders the overwhelming majority of costs, while others enjoy the security umbrella without making comparable investments, political pressure inside that leading nation inevitably begins to build. That is precisely the challenge confronting NATO today. Throughout nearly 80 years of the alliance's existence, the United States has remained its single largest contributor in virtually every strategic category. America maintains an extensive network of military bases across Europe, stations tens of thousands of troops on the continent, provides NATO's nuclear deterrent, missile defense architecture, strategic airlift capabilities, carrier strike groups, intelligence networks, and much of the alliance's integrated command structure. Simply put, without American military dominance, NATO's deterrence posture would look fundamentally different. For decades, American taxpayers have effectively financed a substantial portion of security across the entire transatlantic community. While many European governments have enjoyed the flexibility to devote greater portions of their national budgets toward healthcare, education, social welfare, and energy transition initiatives, Washington has continued allocating hundreds of billions of dollars annually to defense in order to guarantee NATO's credibility against emerging threats. From the perspective of many policymakers in Washington, this imbalance has become increasingly difficult to justify. President Trump argued that the United States was not treated fairly following military operations targeting Iran. According to Trump, several allied governments signaled their unwillingness to participate even before Washington formally requested assistance. Regardless of how one evaluates each individual case, the broader strategic message is unmistakable. If NATO expects America to stand ready whenever Europe faces a crisis, then Washington has every right to expect comparable solidarity whenever American security interests come under direct threat. Trump also recalled a conversation with a former British Prime Minister. According to his account, the British leader indicated that the United Kingdom would be prepared to assist once military operations had concluded. Trump responded that support arriving after the fighting had already ended carried little practical value. The significance of that exchange lies less in the conversation itself than in what it symbolized. For Trump, it represented an informal test of Allied commitment, a measure of whether America's partners would stand beside the United States when it truly mattered. In his assessment, the results were not reassuring. This has been one of the defining themes of Trump's foreign policy since his first administration. He has repeatedly argued that while Washington has consistently honored its Article 5 commitments, there remains insufficient evidence that many allies would demonstrate the same level of resolve should America's own vital interests come under attack. It is precisely this perception of strategic imbalance that has driven the Trump administration's persistent demand for higher European defense spending. Looking at defense budgets over the past decade, Washington's concerns extend beyond simple economic comparisons. While the American economy is substantially larger than most European economies, NATO has never required equal levels of absolute military spending. Instead, the alliance established a common benchmark. Each member should devote at least 2% of its GDP to national defense. Yet for years, numerous allies failed to meet that commitment. The practical consequence has been clear. Every shortfall in European military capability has ultimately been compensated for by American defense spending, American military assets, and American strategic leadership. From a strategic standpoint, this debate is no longer simply about money. If the United States continues to maintain overwhelming military superiority, while many European allies remain below agreed investment levels, Washington will inevitably assume greater responsibility during every major crisis. From deterring Russian aggression and defending NATO's eastern flank, to protecting global sea lanes and responding rapidly to future conflicts. That reality explains why the debate surrounding NATO's future has become increasingly intense. The central question is no longer whether NATO remains necessary. Rather, it is whether the alliance's current burden-sharing model remains politically and strategically sustainable for the United States at a time when America faces expanding global competition on multiple fronts. The budget burden and the growing question of fairness. Perhaps no issue has received greater emphasis from President Trump than financial burden sharing inside NATO. Although this debate is hardly new, the Trump administration has elevated it from a budgetary disagreement into a fundamental strategic question. Should the United States continue underwriting European security at current levels if America's allies remain unwilling to contribute proportionately? According to defense spending figures discussed throughout the policy debate, the United States continues to outspend every other NATO member by an enormous margin. While statistical methodologies differ regarding what constitutes NATO spending versus broader national defense expenditures, one fact remains beyond dispute. America provides the alliance's largest military force, its nuclear umbrella, its carrier strike groups, its global intelligence architecture, strategic airlift capabilities, logistics network, and much of the infrastructure upon which NATO depends whenever a major crisis erupts. In other words, NATO is not sustained merely by treaty obligations. It is sustained by American military supremacy. That reality explains why many security analysts in Washington argue that American taxpayers have spent decades financing not only America's own defense, but also a substantial share of Europe's security. Following the end of the Cold War, many European governments enjoyed what economists often called the peace dividend. Defense budgets were reduced, while greater public resources were redirected toward healthcare, education, welfare programs, and long-term economic development. Meanwhile, the United States continued maintaining one of the world's largest defense budgets to preserve its ability to respond to security crises across multiple regions simultaneously. This growing disparity has fueled an increasingly common question inside Washington. If European leaders acknowledge that today's security environment is becoming more dangerous, why does the overwhelming share of increased military investment still fall upon the United States? Greenland and Washington's evolving strategic calculus. Another issue President Trump raised during his remarks was Greenland. Although the topic has generated considerable controversy in U.S.-Danish relations, from a geopolitical standpoint, Greenland has long occupied a uniquely important position in America's national security strategy. Situated between the North Atlantic and the Arctic Ocean, Greenland commands critical maritime approaches connecting North America and Europe. Its strategic value has only grown as melting Arctic ice opens new shipping routes and intensifies great power competition across the high north. During his remarks, President Trump argued that Denmark has not invested sufficiently in Greenland's defense, despite the island's immense strategic importance to U.S. national security. Whether or not one agrees with Trump's position regarding Greenland's future, the broader strategic message is unmistakable. Washington is increasingly evaluating every region of the world through one overriding lens: its direct contribution to American national interests. This represents a significant departure from the post-Cold War mindset, when Europe was often viewed primarily as America's indispensable strategic partner. Today, policymakers in Washington are increasingly asking a different question. How does a particular region contribute to America's long-term strategic competition with Russia and China? Under this framework, any territory capable of influencing Arctic shipping lanes, missile warning systems, ballistic missile defense, undersea communications, or forward military deployment becomes a matter of vital national interest. That explains why Trump posed a broader question extending far beyond Greenland itself. If Washington continues spending enormous resources to defend Europe, while many of America's own strategic priorities receive only limited support from its allies, is the current alliance structure still serving U.S. interests as effectively as it once did? For many American strategists, Greenland is therefore less about territorial politics than about a larger transformation in U.S. grand strategy. America is no longer measuring alliances primarily by history or sentiment. It is increasingly measuring them by strategic value. A stronger NATO, or simply a heavier burden for America? This has become perhaps the defining strategic question confronting American policymakers. For decades, the United States willingly accepted the role of Europe's ultimate security guarantor. Successive administrations viewed that responsibility as essential to preserving stability across the transatlantic community. Today's strategic environment, however, looks dramatically different. The United States must simultaneously deter China across the Indo-Pacific, maintain military operations throughout the Middle East, secure global maritime trade routes, modernize its nuclear deterrent, expand missile defense capabilities, and prepare for future technological competition. Each of these priorities demands enormous financial resources. As a result, an increasing number of American defense experts argue that the existing model cannot continue indefinitely if many allies persistently spend well below their economic capacity on national defense. From this perspective, Trump's argument is not fundamentally about withdrawing American troops from Europe. Instead, it is about transforming NATO into an alliance where responsibilities are distributed more equitably, one in which the United States is no longer expected to serve as the default responder whenever a security crisis emerges. Without meaningful reform, domestic political pressure inside the United States to reduce its military footprint in Europe is likely to continue growing, regardless of which political party occupies the White House. This reflects a broader shift within American strategic thinking. The debate is no longer centered on whether Europe deserves protection. The debate is whether America's current level of commitment remains sustainable while confronting an increasingly competitive global security environment. Europe's internal challenges and their strategic impact on NATO. Beyond defense spending, President Trump identified two additional issues that, in his view, will largely determine Europe's future: immigration and energy security. Trump argued that these are not merely economic or domestic political concerns. Rather, they are strategic variables that directly affect Europe's ability to generate military power. A continent facing demographic pressures, social fragmentation, and long-term energy vulnerability will inevitably struggle to sustain economic competitiveness, political cohesion, and defense readiness. This has been a recurring theme throughout Trump's political career and among many conservative policymakers across the West. Their argument is relatively straightforward. If European governments fail to secure their borders while simultaneously pursuing stable and affordable energy policies, economic growth will slow, industrial competitiveness will weaken, and governments will possess fewer resources to invest in national defense. From this perspective, immigration policy and energy policy eventually become defense policy. Naturally, this remains a highly contested issue. Many economists and demographic researchers argue that immigration must be analyzed through a broader framework that includes labor markets, aging populations, economic productivity, and long-term demographic trends. Likewise, debates surrounding Europe's energy transition remain complex and multifaceted. Nevertheless, from the standpoint of many strategists in Washington, one conclusion remains difficult to ignore. Any factor that weakens Europe's overall economic or military strength ultimately increases America's strategic burden. If European allies become less capable of defending themselves, Washington will once again be expected to fill the gap. That means more American troops, more American logistics, more American intelligence assets, more American taxpayer dollars. For precisely this reason, many U.S. policymakers increasingly argue that strengthening Europe's own capabilities is not simply beneficial for Europe. It is fundamentally in America's national interest. A stronger, more self-reliant Europe would reduce dependence on U.S. military power while allowing Washington to redirect greater attention and resources toward emerging challenges in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere. In this sense, Trump's criticism should not necessarily be interpreted as opposition to NATO itself. Rather, it reflects an effort to push the alliance toward a model that many American strategists consider more sustainable, one in which European allies assume greater responsibility for defending Europe, thereby enabling the United States to concentrate on broader global priorities without continuously expanding its defense commitments. The Russia-Ukraine war and Washington's effort to reduce America's strategic burden. Another major theme in President Trump's remarks centered on his conversations with both Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. According to Trump, he held productive discussions with both leaders and believes the prospects for a negotiated peace settlement are stronger than they have been in quite some time. Whether such negotiations ultimately succeed remains uncertain. The battlefield remains fluid, and any lasting agreement would require difficult political compromises from both Moscow and Kyiv. Yet, from a strategic perspective, Trump's objective extends far beyond simply ending another war. For the Trump administration, every additional month of fighting carries significant costs for the United States. As long as the conflict continues, Washington must continue allocating military aid, intelligence support, diplomatic resources, and political attention to the European theater, all while simultaneously preparing for a long-term strategic competition with China across the Indo-Pacific. From this perspective, ending the war is not merely about achieving peace, it is about restoring strategic flexibility for the United States. A durable diplomatic settlement would allow Washington to redirect military resources toward other national priorities, reduce long-term defense expenditures, and lessen the growing pressure on America's armed forces. This reflects the fundamentally pragmatic approach that has consistently shaped Trump's foreign policy philosophy. Unlike traditional interventionist strategies that emphasize maintaining extensive overseas commitments indefinitely, Trump's approach begins with a different question. Does this conflict directly advance America's national interest? If the answer is uncertain, Washington should seek an exit strategy rather than an open-ended commitment. Trump also expressed concern over the mounting human cost of the war. He lamented the continuing loss of thousands of soldiers and civilians, and argued that preventing further bloodshed should become an immediate diplomatic priority. Regardless of differing international views regarding the feasibility of peace negotiations, Trump's position follows a consistent strategic logic. Prolonged conflicts consume American resources, negotiated settlements preserve them. For an administration increasingly focused on preparing for long-term competition with China, conserving strategic resources today may prove more valuable than indefinitely financing another major conflict in Europe. NATO's long-term survival depends on a more balanced alliance. Taken as a whole, President Trump's remarks were never simply about one NATO summit or another dispute over defense budgets. They challenged something much more fundamental. Is the transatlantic security architecture built after World War II still suited to the geopolitical realities of the 21st century? That question has become increasingly difficult to ignore. The United States now faces simultaneous strategic challenges unlike anything experienced during the Cold War. China continues expanding its military capabilities and geopolitical influence across the Indo-Pacific. Instability persists throughout the Middle East. Russia remains a significant military competitor in Europe. Emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, hypersonic weapons, and space-based capabilities, are rapidly transforming the nature of global competition. At the same time, America's defense budget faces mounting political and fiscal pressure at home. Against this backdrop, many American strategists argue that Washington can no longer serve indefinitely as Europe's sole security guarantor, while simultaneously confronting growing challenges elsewhere around the globe. The future of NATO, therefore, does not primarily depend on whether the United States leaves the alliance. It depends on whether America's allies are prepared to assume a significantly greater share of collective defense responsibilities. No military alliance can remain politically sustainable if one member consistently bears most of the financial costs, supplies most of the military capabilities, and accepts most of the strategic risks while others contribute well below their capacity. Such an arrangement inevitably generates political resistance within the country carrying the heaviest burden. That dynamic increasingly defines today's debate inside Washington. Trump's objective, therefore, is not necessarily to weaken NATO. Rather, it is to compel the alliance to adapt to a new strategic reality, one in which every member assumes greater responsibility for its own security instead of relying overwhelmingly on American military power. Whether one agrees with Trump's approach or not, the broader debate he has accelerated is unlikely to disappear. It is likely to shape U.S. foreign and defense policy for years to come. America's leadership must be matched by shared responsibility. One strategic reality remains undeniable. NATO's military credibility continues to depend heavily on American leadership. The United States possesses the alliance's largest defense budget, its most capable armed forces, its nuclear umbrella, unmatched global logistics, strategic airlift, intelligence architecture, missile defense systems, and power projection capabilities. Without American leadership, NATO would be a fundamentally different organization. But Washington is making an increasingly clear argument. Leadership does not mean unlimited responsibility. If the United States is expected to remain the cornerstone of transatlantic security, then collective defense must truly become collective, not only in principle, but in practice. That means allies must translate political solidarity into measurable commitments. Higher defense spending, greater military readiness, expanded industrial production, more capable armed forces, and a genuine willingness to share operational risks whenever the alliance confronts major security crises. Absent these changes, pressure inside the United States to reassess its level of military commitment to Europe is almost certain to intensify. In that scenario, NATO's greatest challenge may no longer come from Russia, China, or any external adversary. Instead, it may arise from a far more difficult problem: the persistent imbalance within the alliance itself. Ultimately, the question confronting NATO is not whether America remains willing to lead. The question is whether the rest of the alliance is finally prepared to lead alongside it. Only when collective security is matched by collective responsibility can NATO remain both militarily credible and politically sustainable for the decades ahead.